Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
That's it? Jesus. I suppose we'll just speak on humility this morning then. In case you hadn't noticed all the activity going on up here, I mentioned to Tim that the drier I get, the longer I talk. And he's been running around getting extra pitchers of water and all this stuff. So let me preface any remark that I may make by this fact that if you get through before I get through, it's all right for you to go. Sometimes I talk after I'm finished, and I can tell you now that nothing of any value will happen after that. I mean, it just doesn't. My name is Ray Vowell, and I'm an alcoholic. And my sobriety date is July the 20th, 1971. And thank you. I want to thank the committee for inviting me. What a beautiful conference you have here. And what a beautiful experience it is to be here on Sunday morning and see so many people who got up after facing all the hardships of Saturday night and come out to have an AA meeting. And Sundays are very special to me. I got up this morning and I went down to have breakfast, and it occurred to me that I had choices of what I ate. I didn't have to wait till they decided to bring the oatmeal. Oatmeal is quite an experience if you were an alcoholic like I am, because you know what days they have it. In Dallas County, they have raisins in the oatmeal on Sunday morning. And well, it may sound funny to you, but if it's a highlight of your week, you know, I mean, just the mere fact that I got up, I had a choice over whether or not I ate. I had a choice over what I ate. I had a choice on what I wore, or, you know, I had a choice whether or not to come down here. And to me, those are just benefits of this beautiful program. So let me finish introducing myself. I'm an alcoholic. Someone asked me once, "Are you an addict?" And I said, "I don't know. I really don't know. All I know is that anything that made me feel good and see double, I'd do it. Anything I ever did more than twice that felt good, I became addicted to. So I don't know. You know, I really don't worry about classifying myself. I'm just lucky that I'm just still here. You know. In addition to being an alcoholic, I'm also a preacher, a Baptist preacher. A Southern Baptist preacher. I don't apologize for that. I'm no more ashamed of being a Southern Baptist preacher than I am being an alcoholic. Both conditions are incurable. You just have to learn to live with it. I would say this, that had I an opportunity to do it all over again, I probably would not be a Southern Baptist preacher. I would, in all probability, I would be a televangelist. I think that's a wonderful experience, because the opportunity to stand on national television and tell people to send their money to God and give me your address just somehow appeals to my better nature. I will say this, that in the last few years, my confidence in televangelists has been somewhat shaken. I'm not sure that they always tell the truth. Because they're always saying on TV, God told me to tell you, which implies if you disagree with me, then you're disagreeing with God. I wonder sometimes if God really talks to these people. It would seem to me that if God actually were conversing with these people, he would have said, Jimmy, don't pick up that girl. The police is right behind you. Just a thought. So I not only am an alcoholic and a Southern Baptist preacher, I'm also a licensed psychotherapist in the state of Texas. And so I'm all those things that you like to talk about in closed discussion meetings, and next week you'll have plenty of stuff to discuss. As a therapist, I spend a great deal of my time in a negative setting because I'm around negative people. And I believe that we in Alcoholics Anonymous and Al-Anon Family Group are the most fortunate people on the face of the earth. Because I work every day with people who hate the lives they're living, have an abject fear of changing, and don't even realize they have a choice to change. And would most of them be unwilling to change even if they knew they had the choice. And yet we have been fortunate enough to have found people like us who understand us, and we found a solution to our problem. Now, my personal philosophy about that is that God loves alcoholics more than he loves other people. Now, I don't stand behind this podium and take lightly the opportunity to speak to you this morning, and I don't say things that I cannot support. So let me explain why I believe that. You see, the basic problem of alcoholics is not totally alcoholism, it's moreism. We want more than anybody else in the whole world. I have never wanted one of anything in my life. God knows how we are. He gave the whole world 10 commandments, but he gave us 12 steps. Because he knew that if we didn't get more than the other folks, we wouldn't play. I am not overly fond of people who get up behind the podium and take advantage of crowds to air their own petty grievances, but I am going to air mine. Because I am so sick of the word that it just almost makes me puke when I hear it, and that is the word dysfunction. My God, where do we get the idea that that is the answer to everything? You know? I don't know how would you define dysfunction? Because in order to make a definitive decision, you must have something to compare it with. And so if you say, or I say that I am a dysfunctional person from a dysfunctional family, that implies that somewhere in this world there is a function. That somewhere in this world there is a family that functions. Now, they don't live in my town. And if they exist, I'd like to know where they originated. If you believe the Bible, which I happen to, and you have a choice, I know it's not approved AA literature, but I read it. And in that book, it says that God created man, and then he saw that it was not good for the man to be alone. because he would have been helpless his whole life. You guys see how easy it is to win them over. Look at that. And so he created a helpmate for him. He created a companion for him named Eve. Now, these were the first two people on the face of the earth. They had two sons, and one of them killed the other one, and they got evicted from the first home they had. Does that sound familiar? Well, in that book, according to the story, is that these people, it only took them about 300 years to get so screwed up that nobody could stand them. And so God said, I'm going to wipe the whole thing out and start over again. But I got one guy down here that's got a little family, and they live over here on the edge of the Babylonian plain. And so he tells a guy named Noah to build this big old boat about half the size of the Titanic, and in a place where there's never been enough water to float a canoe. And he spends 120 years doing that. And so it starts to rain, the boat floats, and they spend 6 months floating around with no dry land. Finally, they land on the edge of Mount Ararat, and it begins to dry out, and they need to plant a crop. Guess what they planted? Wheat. They wanted bread, right? No. No. Maybe some frioles, you know. No, they planted grapevines. And the first crop they got, they made jelly and were happy, right? No. The book says that Noah got drunk and got naked in front of his kids. Does that sound familiar? So I ask you this morning, if there are any functional people, where do they come from? Now, I came from a functional family. My father was an alcoholic, and he functioned very well in that capacity. His second duty was to raise hell and fight with my mother, who would hit him, and then they functioned very well. They fought tooth and nail. My father was 6'3", and my mother was 5 foot even, but she won every time. I think she may have been kin to Patty O, because I was listening to Patty last night, and she was describing my mother. So anyway, I listen to these people, and I sometimes wonder if it's me. Have I just gone crazy? See, to me, I think I've come to the conclusion that the reason I drank is that I don't think like other people. I live in a really confused world. And alcohol cleared up my confusion. Now, you're really sick if alcohol can clear up your confusion, because this world still confuses me. I was driving to the airport on Friday to come out here, and I see a car that says, it's got a bumper sticker that says, "Honk if you love Jesus." I honked, and the woman went, but you see, everything around me is like that all the time. I don't know about you, but my wife said, "What's wrong with her?" I said, "Well, maybe she borrowed the car. I don't know." I mean, but I realize, the older I get, the more I realize that my whole life has been that way. I mean, people would tell me things, and they would be totally contrary to the way things were. And I would see things, and I didn't see the same thing other people saw. It's like sometimes it's like I'm not on the right planet or something. I don't know, but it's just a very weird place. And the older I get, the easier it gets, because I don't care. There are advantages to being old. Wally mentioned he was right on he was in his last year of apprenticeship for geezerhood. I am the president of the Geezer Club in my local area. It's a Harley group. I'm head of the Club de Motociclistas de Viejo Rabo Verdes down on the Texas-Mexican border, and that literally translated means the old geezers motorcycle club. And so, you know, I realize now that being old is not bad. It's not terrible. You know, I used to think it must be, but it's not. People don't expect much of you. If you spill stuff on your tie, nobody cares. Zipping up your pants is optional. Getting a parking place at the Dairy Queen is easy. And I just pull in there in the morning and I go, you know. And so now all the nice people park away from the building so us old geezers can get up there. You know? I mean, a lot of things that have transpired. My father used to tell me things that I just totally doubted, but they're gradually coming true. You know? My father once told me when I was about 20 years old that there would be a day when I would have all the sex I wanted. Well, think about that one a little while. And so I watched the world, you know, and I thought, I heard somebody say once in AA that if you want to give a real good AA talk, you got to catch their attention in the first 5 minutes, you know. So let me begin by saying that I woke up naked, upside down, hanging from a hot air balloon over Nantucket. That didn't happen at all, but did I get your attention there for a minute? Boy, what a mental picture that would be, huh? As I look around me, I wonder what's really going on. I was sitting in the mall the other day. My wife and I go shopping. And the way we shop is I sit in the middle of the mall, and she goes from store to store, and occasionally stops by for some more money. I have found a way to speed her up. I now sit in front of Victoria's Secret. It has been my observation that Victoria doesn't have any secrets. If she is, I don't know where she keeps them. I mean, but I'm sitting in front of Victoria's Secret last Christmas. My wife's shopping, and a little girl comes out, and she's got a lace teddy on a hanger, and it's rather attractive. It was red, and it had black lace panels on it and a little fur around it. And she said, "Wouldn't you like to get your wife one of these for Christmas?" And I said, "Yeah, do you have it in flannel?" And she said, so I'm sitting there in the mall waiting for her to get through, and these two kids come down through the mall, and he's got a punk rock haircut. That thing's spiked out this far, and it's orange on one side and blue on the other. And they stop right in front of where I'm sitting, and there's a little booth there that sells sunglasses, and he picks up a pair of sunglasses and he put them on and he says, "How do these look?" And she says, "Take those off. They make you look stupid." So I wonder what's going on in this world. You know, I don't know. I mean, there's a little shop there in that mall that has a sign in the window that says, "Ears pierced while you wait." It's everywhere, folks. On the front door of every post office in the United States, there is a sign that says, "No dogs allowed except seeing eye dogs." Who in the hell is supposed to read that? I don't know. I'm coming back from Wisconsin one time. I've been to a conference up in Madison, Wisconsin, and I had to change planes Sunday afternoon in Chicago. And I don't know, I'm just sitting there waiting on my flight, and And didn't even realize I was sitting on a newspaper. And the guy walks up to me and he says, "Are you reading that paper?" So I just stood up, turned the page, sat back down, and said, "Yes, I am." So I decided many years ago, if I was going to find any sanity in this world, maybe I better go back to church. And well, I didn't want to go to church. I wanted to run one. And so I went to Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth, and I became the pastor of a little church in South Texas. And my first week there, I had to go out and visit my flock. And it just so happened that the first house that I visited was 3 old maids. Now, we don't say old maid in the Baptist church anymore. We say single by choice. It just really keeps me confused all the time, all this semantics and terminology and politically correct. We can't say hymnal in the Baptist church anymore. We tried saying hernal, and that didn't work out too good. And it just something happens when you get there on Sunday morning, and the choir director said, "Oh, everybody stand and take your personal in hand." It kind of upsets the whole balance of things. So anyway, I'm visiting these 3 old ladies that are single by choice, who I personally think if they'd ever had a choice, but anyway, they say to me, "Would you like something to drink?" And I said, "That would be nice." And they all 3 got up and went to the kitchen to fix some coffee and cake, I guess. And so I'm sitting there looking at a magazine, and I look over and there's a bowl of peanuts on the coffee table, and I reach over and got a handful of peanuts, and I'm reading the magazine, and I reach over and got another handful of peanuts. And before they came back, I ate that whole bowl of peanuts. The lady came back and she says, "Well, I see you found our peanuts." I said, "Well, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to eat all of them." She said, "Oh, that's fine." Said, "Since we had our teeth pulled, all we can do is suck the chocolate off of them anyway." So I'm sitting here in this little farmhouse with 3 ladies that are single by choice, and we're drinking coffee and eating cake. And I look up on the piano, and there's a glass of water with a condom floating in it. And I'm trying not to look at it. Have you ever noticed when there's something you don't want to look at, no matter where you turn, it's there? We were at the beach the other day, and my wife said, "I wish you'd quit staring at all these girls." And I said, "Well, God made them, and and I'm just admiring His work." And she said, "That's why God put a hinge in your neck right there." And I said, "Well, why did He make it turn both ways?" So I'm sitting there, and finally I can't stand it. I said, "What's that?" Lady said, "We don't know. We found it in the park. And it said on the package, 'Place on organ for prevention of disease.'" And she said, "We didn't have an organ, so we just keep it up there on the piano." And she said, "We haven't even had a cold all winter." And the reason I tell that story is that reminds me of Alcoholics Anonymous. We don't know what it is, and we don't even know what it's supposed to do, and we don't know how it works, but yet it does. And if we just keep it around and we keep applying ourselves and keep it in sight, well, it works. So I've told you all that just to kind of see where you are this morning. On July the 19th, 1971, in a little tract home in Irving, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas, my wife came to me and said, "The children and I have audited you." And I said, how did I make out? And she said, well, it cost us about $500 a month more to keep you than you bring in, and we can't afford you any longer. And I said, what does that mean? And she kind of put it this way, 14 days from today, you will have been gone 2 weeks. What she actually said was, you're dying and you don't know it, and we don't want to watch it. We're watching you deteriorate before our eyes, and we don't want to see it. So, being an alcoholic and not stupid, see, I did half of the first step for years before I even knew about Alcoholics Anonymous. That admitted thing works. But honey, I'm an alcoholic. And I said that, and she says, but honey, I don't care. And I said, well, would you let me use your telephone? I didn't have one. I had been living in the garage for a while, and because my sanitation wasn't the best, and so she said, what do you want to use the phone for? And I said, I'm going to call AA. And she said, you do that all the time. It doesn't work. And I said, oh, let me try. And she said, okay, go ahead. But as soon as you get off the phone, you're out of here. Well, I knew about AA. They have a machine, and it says you have reached the Irving group of Alcoholics Anonymous, and there's no one here at this time. And I love that. And then I would confess. I'd tell them how bad I was. Of course, there wouldn't be anybody there. And then I'd go back and tell her, they told me maybe I ought not to drink Muscatel. Maybe I ought to try something like Mogan David. And it wouldn't upset my stomach, and I wouldn't be so grouchy. And you know, for a long time, she believed that. I often wondered, I know now that she was desperate to believe in anything. She was grasping. You see, the people who live with us, they have a much harder time than we do, because they don't have an avenue of escape that we have. When things get bad for us, we get drunk, and at least for a little while, we're out of here. They're just there, day in and day out. So I called Alcoholics Anonymous and got a people on the phone. God, what is he doing there? And I said, I'd like to talk to somebody about drinking. And he said, we're having a meeting now. Are you able to come? And I said, can you come if you've been drinking? He said, sure, as long as you stop before you get here. And he gave me the address, and I went back into the garage and poured me a big glass of Mad Dog Doocy Doocy, because I was in my ethnic period at this time. And my wife said, what are you doing? And I said, I talked to Alcoholics Anonymous, and the man said, have a drink and come on down there. See, there's an anatomical fact about alcoholism, and that is that alcoholics have the ability to hear what they want to hear regardless of what's been said. The other anatomical fact is that alcoholics are fully aware that the eardrum and the jawbone don't work at the same time, and so if they talk, they don't have to listen. And so I had a big glass of Mad Dog Doocy Doocy, and I got in my old beat-up car, and I went to my first AA meeting, and when I got there, they were gone. That didn't surprise me. Actually, there's an east and a west, Irving Boulevard, and I went to west, and the meeting was on east. I went to a real estate sales meeting. They looked like alcoholics. I asked them if they were alcoholics and broke up the sales meeting. Okay, now I figure about now my wife will have realized what an effort I'm making. And I went back home. And everything I owned was on the front porch. And that wasn't any big deal. It all fit in one small pillowcase. And I timidly knocked on the door because things are getting desperate. It's midnight, and I don't have any money. And I'm locked out of the house, and the doocy's in there. And so I knocked on the door. She finally came back to the door. I said, "Can I use your phone again?" And she said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, they weren't there." She said, "All right, but make it quick." And so I go back in, I call. I know they'll be gone now. I can talk to the machine. She'll feel better, and we can all get some sleep. And I can get to the doocy. Got people on the phone again. And I said, "Look, I think I may have a drinking problem, and I'd like for y'all to come over here in a week or two and talk to me." And they said, "We could come now." And I said, "Oh, no, I know you guys got to work tomorrow." And because I was a very considerate drunk. I mean, I didn't want to put nobody out. And so they said, "Well, we'd be glad to come." Well, I mean, I'm not an idiot, you know. I'm an alcoholic, and my stuff's out in the yard, and I've only got a limited time on the phone, and I can't get to the Mad Dog Doocy because my wife's standing in the hall, and here's two guys wanting to come to my house. And I said, "Well, come on. Hell, it can't get any worse, you know. I mean, maybe I can con them." Two of the strangest men showed up at my house about 1 o'clock. Man, their names was James and John. I guess Peter was off at night, so I don't know. But I told my wife before they got there, I said, "I want you to get the kids and get in the back of the house because big stuff's fixing to happen here." I was convinced it was. See, they were going to come over to my house and they were going to tell me I couldn't drink, and I was going to whip their ass, and then we'd all be through. Because that's what people did to me in those days. I wasn't around anybody very long until they told me I couldn't drink. And that's the dumbest thing. You know, the deputy sheriff that took me to the Georgia-Alabama line and put me out and said, "Don't look back," he told me, he said, "Your problem is you can't drink." My dad told me about the 19th Sunday morning he came to get me out of jail. He said, "Son, don't you realize you just can't drink?" I wound up in the Navy in San Diego in 1952, and I hadn't been in the Navy 4 months till I woke up one morning and I'd puked all over me and everybody else, and we were in bunk beds, and everybody was really upset, and I didn't understand it was I mean, waking up and puking ain't no big deal, you know. I did it half my life. And there was a chief petty officer standing. He said, "Son, you need to realize you can't drink." I've had total strangers walk up to me, and I'd be laying flat on my back in the gutter, puking straight up. And they'd say, "Man, you can't drink." I don't know what they thought that was, you know. And let me apologize for using the word puke. My wife says, "You know, you got 4 college degrees, you know, and you don't have to use words like puke." I don't know anything else to describe what I did. You know, I have a good vocabulary, but I've never burped up, choked, threw up, or vomited in my life. I puke. I can puke standing straight up and not get any on my shoes. I may get some on your shoes, but, you know, that's another problem. These two idiots came into my house, and they didn't say anything about drinking. One of them said, "You know, just sit down, and you need to learn to take it easy." Well, you couldn't take it much easier than I was taking it in those days. One of them said something like, "Let go and let God." I said, "Oh, no," you know. I didn't have a hold of anything much, and if I did, God certainly wouldn't have wanted it. And then one of them said, "Do you think you could go one day without a drink?" And I said, "Of course." And then the other one said, "When did you?" You know, that's been over 28 years. And I still today can't remember how long it had been since I'd gone a 24-hour period without a drink. And then one of them said, "Would you be willing to try?" And I said, "Well, I'll give it a try tomorrow. It's already too late today." And that's how I was introduced to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm not going into any long stuff, just to simply tell you that they told me where to go if I tried to get me to go with them, and I wouldn't do it. And the next morning I got up and I was really sick. And my wife took me down to the Irving group and dropped me off at the front door real quick because she didn't want to be seen there. And my wife wasn't sick. My wife parked at a furniture store 5 blocks from the group the first 6 months we came to meetings, and walked down the alley to the group because she didn't want anybody to know she's going down there. And I can understand that. She didn't want anybody to know she's going where I was. Next day I wound up down there, and I knocked on the door, and it's a storefront building, and the guy came to the door, ugliest guy I ever saw in my life. He said, "Son, you don't look well." Well, no, I guess not. I've got on 2 different colored shoes. I've got on a pair of khaki pants, and one of the legs is cut off at the knee. I've got on a T-shirt that I don't even know who it belonged to, but it wasn't mine because it only came to about here. I was sort of bare midriff, and I hadn't had a haircut or a shave or a bath, and God knows the last time I brushed my teeth. And he said, "Come on in." And I said, "No, I don't believe I want to come in there. Isn't that where all those drunks hang out?" God, how sick. He said, "Would you like a cup of coffee?" I said, "Yes, sir." And he went and brought me a cup of coffee, and I stood there in the doorway drinking it because I wouldn't go in that building. And as soon as I drank it, I puked on the carpet. And I knew then they'd make me leave because they always did. He didn't. He got me by the arm and he says, "Come on, son." And he took me inside. And he sat me down on a couch over in the corner, and he came back with a bucket and a glass. And I said, "What is that?" And he said, "It's honey, orange juice, and raw egg." Well, I knew what the bucket was for. He said, "Drink this." And I did, and I immediately puked in the bucket. And he went and got another bucket and a mop and cleaned up the first mess. And he brought me another glass. "Drink this." And I did, and I immediately puked it up. And you know, the funny thing happened. I hadn't been there very long until I looked up, and those 2 guys that had been at my house the night before showed up. And those 3 men sat around. Some ladies showed up a little later. And they sat around all day watching me drink honey, orange juice, and raw egg and puke in a bucket while they told jokes about people that drink honey, orange juice, and raw egg and puke in a bucket. Somewhere during all of that, I remember saying, "Would it be all right with you folks if I just pour this in this bucket? Because I'm getting really tired." And they explained to me that even though I wasn't keeping it down very long, that every time I drank that, I was getting a little protein and a little sugar. And it would keep me from going into DTs. Well, it got my attention then. I knew about DTs. Wow. I only remember 2 things definitely about DTs. I had a country and western band that played in my bathroom. And I was the lead singer, and I guess one of the biggest shocks I got in sobriety was to find out I didn't know how to play the guitar. I've been playing for years. And my band, every night we would rehearse, and my wife was working till 11. She's a nurse, and I'd cook for them. And the only thing I knew how to cook was grits. And I only knew how to cook a whole box at one time. And if you cook a whole box of grits, it takes a big salad bowl to hold it. And if you got this big salad bowl full of hot grits, it takes a whole pound of margarine. And then you got, and then if you got a big salad bowl full of hot grits and melted margarine, you cannot eat them with clothes on. And so I would get naked, and I would sit up in the middle of our bed and eat grits and the band would gather around, and we would sing and eat grits. And they were scared to death of my wife. She'd come in about 11:15, she'd say, it's time for the band to go home, and damn, they would just vanish. Leave me to hold the bag and the grits. DTs is plain tap water will not flush green men out of an air conditioner duct. It just will not. They play in it. They love it. So when they said DTs, they got my attention. They took me to my first AA meeting. We didn't have a meeting at the Irving group or they didn't have one that night, but Wednesday night was the Al-Anon night. They had the whole thing, and they took me to Grand Prairie, Texas, and pulled up in front of a Lutheran church. And I said, I'm not going in there. And they said, we don't meet in the church, we meet in a separate building. I said, I'm not going in any of those buildings. Why not? I said, well, because God lives in there. He doesn't know where I am, and I don't want him to. See, I grew up, I'm from a line of Baptist preachers, and I grew up in South Georgia. And I knew God was going to get me because every preacher I ever heard told me. See, the fact was, if God were going to get me, he could have got me a long time ago. But I didn't go. I attended my first AA meeting sitting in a folding metal chair on the sidewalk beside Highway 80 in downtown Grand Prairie and listened through the window. And boy, did I hear some stuff. After the meeting, they took me back to the Irving group, and I saw the worst sight I'd ever seen. The Al-Anons had invaded my house and got my wife. And I walked into that room, and they had her surrounded like a wagon train. And I rescued her. I got her out of there. And then I heard the worst words I think I'd ever heard up to that point. She said, they told me I'm not responsible for your drinking. And I said, well, who is? There are only 2 adults that live at our house, and God, I'd been told I wasn't responsible since I was 14 years old. And I said, we need to go home. She said, have you forgotten? And I said, what? She said, you don't live there anymore. I said, well, what am I supposed to do? She said, beats me. Maybe you ought to talk to those people in there. And she drove off. I said, what about my stuff? She said, still in the yard. She'd had enough. Well, make a long story short, that's how I got there, and I really got involved in AA. Man, I went to them meetings every night, them dumb old discussion meetings, sitting there thinking about what I was going to say when my turn came, and saying what I wanted to say when I got a chance, and then thinking about what I had said for the rest of the hour. And I don't know what y'all laughing about. You've all done the same thing, every one of you. I'm sitting there one night waiting for my turn to speak, and I saw this phenomenon on the wall. It wasn't a vision, it was a little plaque, and it said, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and our lives had become unmanageable. I said, wow, what a concept. So the next morning I got up and I went to see the sheriff of Dallas County, and I said, Sheriff Decker? And he said, yes, Ray, because we were on a first name basis. And I said, I've joined Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm powerless over alcohol, and my life has become unmanageable. And he said, well, that's good to hear, but you're still going to the joint if you don't make those checks good. Now, I don't know what the joint is in Nevada, but in Texas it means you're going to take an accelerated course in agriculture, and you ain't going to get paid. You're going to pick a lot of cotton. So I went out to the place where I worked, and a strange thing happened there. There was somebody else at my desk. I found out he'd been there 2 months. But I went to my boss, who was a doctor, and I said, Dr. Alexander, I've joined Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm powerless over alcohol, and my life has become unmanageable. And he said, well, Ray, I'm glad to hear that. But he said, Friday's still your last day. Your suspension is over. And you didn't make, you just didn't make it. So my wife worked across the street at Parkland Hospital. And I went over there and I said, honey, I've joined Alcoholics Anonymous and I'm powerless over alcohol and my life has become unmanageable. She said, Well, I'm glad you realize that, but, you still can't come home. But a funny thing happened. In a few days, I got a call from Henry Wade, who was the district attorney in Dallas County. And he said, Sheriff Decker talked to me about you, and we decided to dead file your case for 90 days, just see what you do. My boss called, and he said, we're going to extend your probation for 90 more days. We just want to see what you're going to do. They said, you still can't come home. But I thought, what the heck, 2 out of 3 wasn't a bad deal in those days. And so I kept going to them dumb old meetings. And I listened to what you said, if you agreed with me. And I took to heart anything you said that I thought I could use. But on Saturday nights, we had a beginners meeting. Oh, boy. I love the beginners meeting. Beginners meeting is for everybody who had less than 90 days sobriety, and they had one old moss back in there that would run it. I had a guy named Curly G. He was my age now. Been sober 28 years, same length I have now, and he was an irascible old fart. He smiled all the time. I mean, I never saw him. He didn't. I thought, God, this guy must have terrible gas or something. He just smiled all the time. And he he talked in platitudes, and he'd say, it'll pass. I thought, shit, yeah, we all pass. But Curly chaired the beginners meeting, and I loved it because beginners meeting goes something like this. First speaker would say, I used to drink shoe polish. The next speaker said, that ain't nothing. I used to drink kerosene lit. Next speaker said, I got drunk one time in Nashville and woke up in Memphis. Oh. Next speaker said, heck, that ain't nothing. I got drunk one time in Hong Kong and I woke up in Montreal, Canada in my car. And the next speaker would say, I've been married 5 times. Next guy said, heck, that ain't nothing. I've been married 3 times since lunch. Twice to my sister. And I'm sitting there waiting on my turn. And this irascible old fart had this irritating habit of asking the group questions and looking straight at me. And I'd answer him. And he stops the meeting. And he said, I'd like to ask you guys a question. But he looked right at me. He said, have you ever been so drunk you didn't remember what you did? And I said, yes, sir. Lots of times. He said, I'd like to ask everybody another question. But he looked right at me. He said, have you ever woke up in the bed with a 95-year-old woman with sores all over her body? I said, hey, no. And he said, how do you know? That remark by that old man put me into the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because I realized for the first time in 38 years of living, I didn't have a clue what I'd done. I didn't know where I'd been. I didn't know about a lot of my life. So I got up and I walked out of the meeting and I went to my sponsor's house. I have to tell you about my sponsor. He came up to me one night after the meeting and he said, my name's Al Z and I'm your sponsor. And I said, I haven't chosen the sponsor yet. He said, yes, you have, and I'm him. I said, I thought you got to choose your own sponsor. He said, you do, you did, and I'm him. Now, I haven't had a drink in quite a while. I don't remember doing that. And finally, he took pity on me and he said, "You don't understand, do you?" I said, "No, sir." He said, "We had a meeting of the steering committee and it was decided that if we made you stop coming to meetings, you'd probably die. But if we were going to allow you to continue to come, somebody had to take charge of you because you're just too damn disruptive." And he said, "We drew straws to see who would do that, and I lost." Al was my sponsor for 22 years, till he died. And I guess I loved him as much as any man I ever knew. He never told me a lie in all those years. I didn't like the truth that he told me a lot of times. The kindest thing Al ever said to me was, "You know, I don't think you're going to make it." That was about 2 years before he died. I had 21 years sobriety. And I went to Al's house and I knocked on the door and he came to the door and I'm standing on the porch with big tears running down my face. And he said, "What now?" And I said, "I've just found out a terrible thing." And he said, "What's that?" I said, "I don't know what I've done." And he said, "Ray, none of us know what we've done." I said, "To hell with the rest of you. I'm talking about me." This has become real personal. You see, this has suddenly changed from sitting around in a group listening to interesting stories from people to the reality that I'm involved and I'm responsible. And no matter how long I live, I never again will have the right to judge another human being because I don't know what I've done. I can no longer look down my nose at anybody else because I don't know what I've done. So if I judge you, I may well be judging me. And he looked at me and he said, "It just might be that you're ready to take certain steps." And he didn't say, "Read a book," or "I'll meet with you Tuesday." He got me by the arm and he took me in his living room. And we began a process that night that I have personally been working on ever since. Some 27 and a half years. And Al taught me by example. And Al taught me that there are three meanings of AA. There's Alcoholics Anonymous, of course. There's absolute abstinence. But the most important and vital meaning of AA is admitted and accepted that we are powerless over alcohol. And that our lives have become unmanageable. He taught me that the two tools that every alcoholic relies on is rationalization and justification. And as long as we can rationalize the way our actions and justify what we're about to do, we'll continue to do them. We're sitting in a meeting one Sunday morning. Just before the meeting started, the phone rang. Al answered the phone and he said, he kept motioning for me to pick up the extension. And there was a lady on the phone. She said, "I'm drunk." Like, I care. You know? And then I thought, how many times I called people all over the country to tell them I was drunk. Like all of you were waiting with bated breath, you know. And she said, "It's not my fault." Well, I knew that. She said, "It's the peanut butter." He said, "You got drunk on peanut butter?" She said, "Hell no, we don't have any peanut butter." And my husband came home and raised Cain, and I went down to the 7-Eleven and I bought 2 6-packs of Budweiser and I drank all 12 of them. And he said, "Lady, wouldn't it have been simpler to have just bought a jar of peanut butter?" And she said, "To hell with him. I don't care if he ever gets any more peanut butter." Now we laugh. But I challenge you this morning, how many times have you deliberately started a fight so you could stomp out of the house and go get drunk? How many alcoholics have you ever seen in your life who said to their husband or their wife or their mother or their father, I'm going to go and I'm going to change my whole personality for a while. I'm going to screw up everything I see. I'm going to sleep with people I don't even know their names. I'm going to fight people that I never even met. I'm going to jail. I may go to the hospital. I'm going to spend every dime I can get my hands on, but don't worry, babe, I'll be back. No, you never heard that in your life. You never heard that from an alcoholic. Even alcoholics don't say that to other alcoholics. Yeah. And then he says, I want you to look real careful at step 2. And I said, I've already done step 2. I love step 2. It said insanity. I love that. I thought I was just sorry as hell. Everybody told me that. And I came here and you said, you're sick. In fact, you're crazy. Well, that explains it. I can remember, saying to my wife, don't let the neighbors know I've been drinking. And she'd say, well, how must I explain you being naked out in the yard? And I'd say, tell them I'm sick. I love this insanity thing. My wife took me to a psychiatrist one time, and we all have a psychiatrist story, but he looked at me over there. He said, son, I said, yes, sir. He said, I'm going to give you some pills. I said, you are? He said, uh-huh. I said, okay, because I love pills. I love pills, any kind of pill. Somebody told me the other day, said, when you talk behind the podium and you say pills, your eyes light up. Well, that's not true. I have glaucoma and I'm taking drops, so well, maybe it is true. I don't know. But I do. Red pills, green pills, round pills, short pills, little pills, big pills. I just love pills. Back when I was drinking, if I ever came to your house, I went straight to your bathroom. I want to look in your medicine cabinet. I've had enough Midol. I wouldn't have a cramp. I'll be 150 years old. I remember the time I found the little plastic thing with dates on it. All these guys back there said, what's he talking about? I have a friend who's a Jesuit priest up in Ottawa, Canada. Told me one time, said, did it ever occur to you you may be responsible for getting some woman pregnant you never even met? So I said, what do these pills do, Doc? And he said, they make you deathly sick if you drink. And I said, hell, I already get deathly sick when I drink. He said, you know you're going to get sick and you drink anyway? I said, uh-huh. He said, I don't understand that. I said, me neither. But he's a pretty smart old doc. I did get deathly sick. In fact, I wound up in intensive care and stayed there 3 days and probably would have been there a little longer, but I drank the alcohol out of the thermometer glass and they kicked me out. But I never did take no more of them pills. You see, let me tell you something. And I don't want to sound like an old mossback, but back in those days, there were some old tough guys in AA. And some of you know what I'm talking about. And I looked at them guys, the book says it very plainly. I just came, I didn't bring anything, I didn't have anything, and I just came to them old meetings. And one day I came to, and I began to hear what they were saying. And I'm listening to these guys that have done everything you can think of doing. These guys have really had a terrible life. I'm not exactly acquainting that to me, but and then one day, I thought, well, they're not sick anymore. These guys live normal lives. They've got wives and children and grandchildren, and on birthday night and on potluck night, they come with all these kids with them and stuff. And I wonder how that happened. So I asked my sponsor, I said, how did old so-and-so get to work? God, he ought to be dead. He said, well, so should you. I said, he ought to at least been in prison. He said, so should you. By the way, Wally, I've been in jail 3 times in one day, too. You're the only other guy in AA I've heard that. I went back twice to show them they couldn't do it in Dallas. And then I said, well, what happened? My sponsor said, well, they're working this program, and if you work this program the way they work this program, you'll be like them. And I saw a little ray, I saw a little spot of light out there in the future that said, that could happen. I'm not sure it will. I doubt it a lot, but it could happen. It has happened. It's happened to him, and it's happened to him, and it's happened to her back there, and it's happened to so-and-so, and I could name you about 10 people that I really admired the way they drank. You know, they were my kind of folks, and it happened to them. Maybe it could happen to me. And I came to believe that it was possible. And then we got to step 3, and I said, well, Al, let's don't do that because that's God's stuff. Let's just go on to 4. I said, I know a lot of people dread step 4, but I'm willing to just go and get in it right now. And he said, we got to do step 3. And I said, well, I don't want to do step 3. I don't like step 3. And he said, why not? I said, well, it says God in there. And he said, that's right. I said, what God they talking about? He said, your God. I said, oh, no. Oh, no. I'm not going to get into that. I told you where I came from. And I grew up listening to people tell me that in order for God to love me, I had to do what they said. And I couldn't do it. And I found out they couldn't do it either. You know? I grew up believing that I had to be perfect before God would have anything to do with me. And until I understood everything there was about God, I wouldn't have any relationship with God. Let me tell you a little interesting story real quick. And that quick doesn't mean much, but I preached in a little black Baptist church not too long ago in Texas, and I guess I got kind of long-winded because they'll really preach you to death. They'll work you, you know. And I said, and finally, and I said it about 5 times. I said, and finally, and some guy back up in the choir said, yeah, but not immediately. In 1955, at the Naval Hospital in San Diego, California, I went down to the nurse's station to steal a cup of coffee. I had on surgical scrubs, and I saw the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my life. And I fell in need. And she fell in sick. You know what? I saw her, and I thought, boy, that's what I want. And she looked at me. We began a date. And one night we were out, and she said, if you want what I've got and are willing to go to any lengths to get it, you must take certain steps. And some of these I bought. But my efforts were nil until I let go absolutely. Now that didn't happen. You know that didn't happen. But the reason I tell it that way is this, is we met in February and we got married in May. And I thought, I know this girl. And she thought she knew me. We got married, went down to Ensenada on our honeymoon. We woke up in a Mexican hotel and both of us were in bed with a stranger. We didn't know each other at all. I only knew one fact. I knew enough about her to know that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. And that was enough. We've been married 45 years. And you know what? I don't know her. There's a lot of things I still don't know. Boy, I get surprises all the time. Thank God. But I still know this much. I know enough to know that I want to spend the rest of my life with her. And that's enough for us to build a relationship on. Oh, I know her a whole lot better than I did in Ensenada. Believe me. But I still don't know everything. And I kind of put my faith in God on that basis. I don't know everything there is about God. I just know enough to know that He does a better job than I can. That's my understanding of God. Now, it doesn't have anything to do with church. Church doesn't have anything to do with church. I've just retired after 26 years in churches, and churches don't know anything about church. You see, they got it all messed up. I don't know. Well, they just did it because they wanted to take control, you know. See, religion in the United States today is men trying to show God how good they are. Spirituality is just simply being humble enough to let God show you how good He is. Those are the differences. I found that out in this place. I taught at seminary, and a young preacher came up to me one day and said, Dr. Bowell, what is your philosophy of religion? I've been waiting 65 years for somebody to ask me that. I said, God will give you what you need when you need it, as soon as you're capable of taking care of it. But if you pray for potatoes, you better damn sure have a hoe in your hand. Because God ain't going to do a thing for you you can do for yourself. And He ain't going to do things for you just because you want them. I'm not going through the rest of the steps. I'm going to wind this down. You need to get your sponsor and go through those. Al and I worked through those steps, and I became a thumper. Boy, I had a big book. I wore it. I used to drag it through the dirt so it would look worn. I went through it with a yellow highlighter, and I marked all these important passages. I found out later that after I got sober that I even had the bibliography marked in the back. I think how sick we get. Legal problems began to clear up. I went back to work. I began to take a bath. They let me come back home. And I know now, I thought that took forever. I know now that it took just exactly the right amount of time. I can tell you here this morning, if they'd have dropped the charges at the jail and I got my job back and if they'd have let me come back home that first week, I'd have been drunk full sundown. You got to understand. You got to go there. So I'm going, I'm carrying this old dirty book around that I dragged around in the dirt to make everybody think I'm really a guru. And I don't like anybody that doesn't take my program real serious. Don't laugh. Don't laugh. If you laugh, you surrender in control. And if you surrender control, you're going to wind up drunk. Don't get mad. Get mad, you'll lose control, you'll get drunk. Don't enjoy nothing. We're not supposed to enjoy anything. I mean, we've been the scum of the earth for most of our lives. What right do we have to have any fun? I'm sitting in the Irving group one Saturday afternoon, they're setting up for bingo. I'm against that. That's gambling. And then after bingo, they're going to take all the chairs down and they're going to dance. And I'm against that. And while they're doing that, they're laughing and joking and having fun and telling funny stories, and they don't know what AA is about. They haven't suffered. So I got in my car. When I feel like that, I always know. Al said to me, when you think something and everybody else is against it and you're the only one that thinks it's right, you're wrong, always. And I went down to Al's office, and I walked in, and I sat down, and I said, I want to know one thing, Al. When is some of this good stuff going to start happening to me? And he looked at me, and he said, where do you live? I said, I live over Northwest Park. Where you sleep? I said, in the master bedroom with my wife. Huh. Where do you work? I said, Al, you know all this. I've been promoted at work. I'm head of the department. Well, how'd you get down here today, Ray? I said, hell, Al, in my new car. And he looked at me and he said, Ray, I hope you stay around AA long enough for something good to happen to you. And I left Al's office that day, and I went down to a little park in Irving, and I sat there all afternoon and cried. First time I'd cried in years. It just seemed like once it started, it wouldn't stop. And I thought about how blind and dumb I had been. I thought about the night my son graduated from high school. He graduated in Irving Stadium where the Cowboys played. There were 2,500 people there for that graduation, and most of them had been planning to be there for 4 years. I was there because my son had personally invited me. And after the graduation, he brought his friends up and he said, this is my dad, guys, and we're proud of him. The next year when my daughter graduated, she was valedictorian. We were on the front row, right in the middle of the stage when she gets ready to make her speech. She said, this is my dad. I thought about the day that my wife said, let's go over to a voice recital. I said, I don't want to go to a voice recital. I want to go play golf. And she insisted, and that wasn't like her. So we went over to this little auditorium on the edge of Irving, and we went in, and I said, where are the kids? Well, she said, our son's gone camping, and our daughter's busy. And when they started the recital, it was my daughter. She sang that afternoon in 5 languages. And I didn't even know she could sing. And I sat there in that little room, and I cried again, and I didn't care. I don't care who sees me cry. I don't care who sees me show emotions, because I never had any before. 1980, I told my wife, I said, I want to go back to school. I want to get my doctorate. And she said, well, why don't you? I said, honey, I'll be 50 years old before I graduate. She said, well, you're going to be 50 in 4 years either way. In 1984, I graduated summa cum laude with a PhD in Christian psychology. I was 50 years old. In October of that year, our daughter gave birth to the prettiest little red-headed boy you ever saw. Unless it was the one that was born 3 years later, or the little girl that was born 3 years after that, or the 3-year-old that we got recently. That little boy was 3 years old. I was attending school in Dallas. We had a suite of rooms in one of the hotels, and my daughter came to me and she said, Daddy, would you like to take Ryan over to the hotel and keep him all night? That little boy had never been away from his parents overnight, and I said, you'd let me do that? And she said, yes, sir. And I went to Walmart and bought $40 worth of red trucks. And we're sitting in that hotel room, and that little boy's playing with those trucks, and all of a sudden he threw those trucks down on the floor, and he comes running across, and he jumps up in my lap, and he puts his arms around me, and he said, Papa, I love you. And again, I cried. Not because the little boy said he loved me, but because I had been trusted by my daughter, who used to be so afraid of her father that she would lock herself in the bathroom and sleep in the bathtub. I had been trusted by her with the most precious possession she owned, her child. And I knew that night that not only was I recovering, but I had been forgiven. And I had been restored to the place where I most wanted to be in the world. When my granddaughter was born, I was speaking at a conference in Oklahoma, and I called home, and my wife was so excited. She said, we have a granddaughter. And I said, that's great. Is Kitty okay? Yes, she's fine. Baby okay? Yeah. Don't you want to know what her name is? And I said, oh, yeah, what? She said, Jacqueline Ray. I left that night and drove all the way back to Irving. I got there about daylight. I went straight to her hospital room, and I woke her up. And I said, I want to know one thing. Why didn't you name one of them boys after me? And she began to cry. And she said, Daddy, that was the first name I ever picked out. But it just had to be a little girl. So you'll know how I feel. 3 years ago, my 40-year-old son, who looked like Grizzly Adams, and his 40-year-old wife, never had any children. A boy that I sponsor called me, and he said, is your son and daughter-in-law still looking for a child? And I said, oh, yeah, but they've about given up. He said, my sister out in California is sponsoring a girl who's 8 months pregnant. And protective services have told her they're going to take the child because there's 2 other children in the home. They've already been removed, and they're not going to let a child go into that home because of her husband. And so we got an attorney, and they contacted this girl. And to make a long story short, August was 3 years ago. We get a call one morning. They jump on an airplane, fly to Escondido. And they're standing in the delivery room when this little boy's born. He weighed 11.5 pounds. Yeah, well, they're 6'5" Grizzly Adams. You don't want to hand him nothing too tiny, you know. By the way, I found out why young people have children and old people don't. We'd lay them down, forget where we put them. And I got to tell you something, it's been a joy to watch him and that little boy. He's a hoot. I was up there about 3 weeks ago, and I hear this sound, and these little feet come down the hallway. And then I hear this clomp, 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 and it's my son chasing that little boy with a water pistol. And a little bit, they come back the other way, and the little boy's got a water pistol, and he's chasing his daddy. And then they get these big old foam rubber things, and they're beating each other and sword fighting. It's a hoot. But my son said to me, Daddy, we're sitting out under a tree one night. He said, Daddy, you know, it's occurred to me that every good thing in our life has come from the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I want to say to you, I agree with him. I'm no expert. We don't have experts in Alcoholics Anonymous. Sober's as high as you get. I know 3 basic things. Number 1, I know which drink makes me drunk. And that's the first one, and I don't ever want to forget that. Number 2, I know who, with God's help, has the choice of whether or not I take that. And that's me. I don't ever want to forget that. And number 3, I owe a debt. I owe a debt to the 2 men who came to my house in 1971 when I so desperately needed help. And I remember going back to those men 3 years later and saying, what can I do for you? And they said, you can't do anything for us because you don't have anything we need. But if you want to pay us back, you remember what happened. And when somebody reaches out, you be there. Thank you, and God bless you.
I think we got a great talk going on here. Thanks for watching the channel. Taper Dave here. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst, then one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, oop, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it it calibrates the gimbal. I don't know if that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right. But I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.